Hello everyone, so this is a further clarification video to go over more of the topics related to Islam and the criticisms of Islam and what non-Muslims tend to get wrong when trying to discuss Islam with Muslims. This is the second video. Hopefully Sue will put a link in the description bar to the first one. I just wanted to make clear that I'm not making the argument that Islam is good or true. I saw a lot of people in the comments saying that. It objectively isn't good or true. So what I'm trying to do instead is to correct the mistakes that get made most often when people are trying to confront Muslims. It's like when an SJW tries to correct a non-SJW by calling them a racist. I think most of Suit's audience are anti-SJW and have probably been called some variation of alt-right, racist, or misogynist or something. And when that happens, you immediately stop listening to the person who said it because they've completely misrepresented your view. And that's what I, as an ex-Muslim, see happening when non-Muslims try to talk to Muslims. And it's why I'm making these two videos. I want to stop that happening because the conversation needs to happen. Non-Muslims need to be able to express their concerns about Islam and Muslims, and if from the start you show a complete ignorance of their positions and the history of Islam, they're not going to listen. I'm not speaking from a position of promoting the comparative morality of Islam. That's not my goal at all. My goal is to help you, the listener, convey your concerns about the comparative morality of Islam to Muslims in a more effective way. And to do that, you need to know what language will be effective and what language won't. Also, I'm not trying to compare the relative morality of Islam versus Christianity or Western values. That's not what I do on my channel in general. I try to shed light on the historical and political contexts that shape the creation of the Islamic and other Abrahamic texts. If you divorce the text from their historical context, you won't understand why people are doing the things that they're doing, and that doesn't just go for atheists or Christians looking at the Quran and Hadith. It goes for Muslims as well. So what I do is trying to add the historical context back into books that has been ripped out of. So just as a brief example, if you look at the Psalms, you will see, "Thou art my son, this day have I begotten you," followed quickly by, "Be thou exalted above the heavens, let thy glory be over all the earth." And it can be easy to assume that these verses are talking about Jesus. However, if you go read the Enuma Elish, an ancient Babylonian sacred text that predates these chapters of Psalms, you can actually see that these verses are part of a story. One goddess chose a champion to destroy the world, and the gods set him as her son and chosen spouse, and then Marduk was sent to destroy them. Marduk said that he could crush the rebellion, but that in exchange he wanted his fate to become preeminent, and for his position to be elevated above all the other gods in the pantheon. When he did crush the rebellion and returned to the realm of the gods said to him, "Be thou exalted, O God, above the gods, let thy glory be over all the earth." So once you restore the original context to these verses, they make more sense, even if in the process, the theology that currently surrounds them is destroyed. So for example, if you don't understand that the two genders in ancient Islam were not has a penis and has a vagina, they were can get it up around a woman and can't get it up around a woman, you're not going to understand why Iran thinks that sex changes are an appropriate measure to treat homosexuality. That's not me justifying Iran forcing people to get sex changes. It's me trying to explain to people who look at it as insane why the government of Iran doesn't see it the same way. It's not a judgment on the relative morality of Iran's actions. It's a statement about what happened in the past that is influencing policies in the present. In the same way, the Islamic conquest of the Middle East was not moral. However, it happened, and it's important to understand why it happened. The Roman Empire was on the verge of falling due to complex factors. They would have lost land to whoever attacked them first. It just so happens that it was the Muslims who managed to organize an army. That doesn't make Islam inherently true, like many Muslims believe, nor does it make it more inherently violent, like many non-Muslims believe. It's just a matter of historical fact. The treatment of the proletariat by Muslims was not significantly worse than their treatment under the Romans or previous empires. That isn't to say that they were treated well or had happy, healthy lives. They weren't, and they didn't. Their lives were short and miserable, but they were also short and miserable under the Romans and other previous regional empires. Islam happened to be the last of the regional empires, but that doesn't make it the most brutal historically. And they were about the same as their predecessors, the Romans, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Medes, and so on. The thing is, the written accounts are written by people who can write. Illiteracy wasn't much of a priority to the bourgeoisie of the time in regards to the proletariat in any of these empires. The only thing that Islam changed in regards to the lives of the proletariat was who the bourgeoisie were, and that would have been changed anyway. The reason why people continued living in any of these empires as opposed to forming a democracy probably wasn't that they enjoyed it, it's that they probably didn't see any alternative. Whether the government was a democracy or theocracy, they were still going to be spending sun up to sundown caring for grain or animals, working metal, making bricks, or something equally mundane, exhausting, and repetitive. The vast majority of people didn't have the time or energy to worry about the finer points of theology. Again, this isn't excusing Islam, it's just pointing out the reality on the ground. If you asked a 9th century peasant in the Muslim lands if he would be happier doing the same job in the Christian lands, he probably wouldn't have had much of an opinion, and vice versa. I think it's important to divorce the modern context of people spreading Islam through violence with the historical context, because it takes a bit of the wind out of modern Islamist sails. Agreeing with them that Islam was always this way and always will be doesn't do much to help the cause of convincing people not to become Islamists. You can disagree with me on that point, but that's my opinion. Like I said in the first video, I think non-Muslims should stop using the word taqiyya. The reason isn't that I think Muslims never lie, it's that I don't think it's productive. I think Muslims just stop listening the minute they hear the word come out. Tawriya is a slightly better word to use. Not assuming every Muslim is trying to lie to you is also an option. Unless you have clear evidence that someone is lying to you, it's generally a good idea to accept them at their word when they say things and then explain to them why they're wrong about those things. For example, if you meet a Muslim who says, "I believe child marriage is wrong," it's often going to be more productive to point out the cognitive dissonance of Muhammad marrying a 9-year-old and then refusing to let his own daughter be married at age 9 because according to him, she was still a child. So are people who are 9 years old children, or are they not? Highlighting cognitive dissonance is almost always a better tactic than just saying you're a liar. At least it is if you want to have a chance of a productive conversation. Even if you do want to say someone is lying, taqiyya is the wrong way to do it, since according to the research I've done and that other ex-Muslims have done and all the research I've heard of, it was never said by Muhammad in the Quran or Hadith, and was instead first used by his son-in-law Ali some 50 years after Muhammad's death. There's plenty of bad stuff you can talk about when you're trying to discuss Muhammad and his teachings, so I think you should stop bringing up the one thing that he didn't do in favor of all the ones that he did. For example, his wars of extermination against entire communities, his raids on Meccan merchants who were just doing the 7th century equivalent of a truck convoy, or his rape of his female slaves and condoning the rape of slaves in general, since slaves are, by definition, unable to withhold consent. Another thing to criticize Islam about, if you want to criticize Islam, is to point out that in Sharia, a woman's word is only worth half as much as a man's. A very good hadith to point out the stupidity of this is Bukhari number 304. Once Allah's apostle went to the Masala to offer prayer on Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr prayer. He was then passed by the women who said, "O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire are you women." They asked, "Why is it so, O Allah's apostle?" He replied, "You curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you." The women asked, "O Allah's apostle, what is deficient in our intelligence and religion?" He said, "Is not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man?" They replied in the affirmative. He said, This is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't it true that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menses? The women replied in the affirmative. He said, this is the deficiency in her religion. So he's creating a circular argument. He first laid out the rules that women's testimony is only worth half as much as a man's, and that women can't pray or fast during their menstrual cycles, and then when asked to justify the reasons why he said women are worth less than men, he justifies it by pointing at the rules he just gave them. Another thing to criticize Islam that I personally find interesting is the problem of time zones and Ramadan. They are building so tall that the time when you can break your fast at the top of the tower is different than the time you can break your fast at the bottom. There are places on Earth with 24 hours of sunshine or darkness for long parts of the year, meaning if Muslims were to take the rules literally, they either wouldn't have to fast or would have to fast without eating or drinking the entire month in those areas. In areas with a much higher or lower latitude than Arabia, it's becoming somewhat common for Muslims to create their own rules regarding Ramadan, such as using the moon sighting in Mecca to tell them whether or not they can break their fast instead of local time. Muhammad obviously hadn't thought about what would happen if Islam went global. Indeed, he doesn't seem to have had a grasp on how big global was. The Qibla, or direction of prayer, is another example of his short-sightedness in regards to the size of the globe. The Jews have their own version where they face the Temple Mount, but with Judaism it's far more obvious to the adherents, both ancient and modern, that they should have an Israel-centric worldview. If you listen to Matisyahu's song Jerusalem, you can hear a line from a very ancient psalm, Jerusalem, if I forget you, may my right hand forget its skill, which I think is a perfect example of how central being in Israel is to both modern and ancient Judaism. Islam, on the other hand, doesn't have that. While you're expected to go on Hajj at least once in your lifetime, it's not a permanent destination. You only have to spend a week there. It's not somewhere where you're expected to build your home. But when you get back to Britain or Australia or America or whatever, you're still expected to face in the direction of Mecca every time you pray, which involves some amazing math to get right. Islam was obviously not prepared for that. Instead, it was made with wandering Bedouins in mind, people who had a keen sense of direction because they were constantly traveling over huge tracts of desert with no landmarks or roads in sight, just an ever-changing landscape of sand dunes. You can also point out how small Muhammad thought the universe was. During the Miraj, Muhammad's miraculous journey to Jerusalem and heaven, he supposedly traveled up to heaven as if it's a location in the physical universe. He believed that you could travel just a few hundred meters upward and see heaven. The creature he rode on, Buraq, is a mythological hybrid with the face of a human and the body of a horse. It's exactly as plausible as centaurs and fawns. All the arguments that you can make against those hybrids apply to Buraq equally. Enough people believe in a literal interpretation of the story that when a balloon shaped like a horse was accidentally released during a thunderstorm in Saudi Arabia, people reacted as if they were seeing Buraq, with crowding the streets and shouting Allahu Akbar at the top of their lungs. I'll provide a link to that video in my description. The balloon manufacturer was eventually identified based on the silhouette of the horse balloon, but many people still believe that this was a sighting of Buraq. I was also asked to go into more detail about the differences between the sects and madhabs of Islam. The Shia are the comparatively easier sect to explain, so let me explain them first. The Ayatollah is basically the Shiite Pope. He isn't considered quite as infallible, but his fatwas are considered the final word on Shiite affairs. The Shiite version of reverence of Mary is their reverence of Ali. Although the vast majority won't address prayers to Ali, they do believe it is important to remember his life and deeds. Just like the church has in some areas people who self-flagellate around Easter, many Shia will self-flagellate around the death of Hussein bin Ali, or the son of Ali. This ranges from the mild, which is barely more than patting yourself, to the extreme, which is people hitting themselves with metal whip. The Sunni, on the other hand, are more aptly compared to Protestants. Just as there are numerous different sects like the Lutherans, Methodists, and Episcopalians, all of which have their own founders who disagreed slightly on the tenets of the faith. Sunni Islam has 4 main madhab, or schools of thought. These are, in no particular order, Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Shafi. The Hanafis are the sect with the most adherents. Their madhab is based on the writings of Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man. He lived from 702 CE to 772 CE. He was a big proponent and is often considered the founder of analogical reasoning in giving religious edicts or fatwas. The Muslim empire was already far larger than Muhammad had expected, meaning that there were lots of challenges Muhammad hadn't foreseen. Abu Hanifa's way of dealing with these challenges was to find something that was in some way analogous in the teachings of Muhammad and then base the decision on that. Ijtihad, which literally translates to effort, is the name of that process. So just as an example, while Muhammad never dug trenches to irrigate areas not reached by rivers, he did dig wells. So by analogy, you could reason that digging ditches is okay because digging wells is okay, and both serve to give water to you and a place that where you didn't previously have access to it. This provides significant flexibility since almost anything can serve as the basis of an analogy, which is likely why Hanafi Islam is the most widely practiced. So to recap that, in Hanafi Islam, you take the Quran and Hadith, and if something isn't spelled out in black and white, you use an analogy to something that is in the Quran and Hadith, and then relate it back to the thing that you are trying to make a ruling on, and that's how you derive your laws. The majority of this school of Islam's inhabitants are in Pakistan, although they also reach up from through to Russia and Europe, and most American converts to Islam are Hanafis. The best sect of Christianity to compare it to is the Episcopalians. While they can be rather strict, the open nature of interpreting the religious text also allows them to justify virtually anything, from female religious leaders to gay rights. Quran-only Muslims, which is a very new subsect, base their ideas that aren't directly from the Quran on the analogy way of deriving things, making them the closest to being a subsect of the Hanafi, and from my observations, most of this stuff they do is still extremely similar to the Hanafi. Quran-only Muslims are best compared to the Church of England. They take what they think sounds good and they throw out the rest. Maliki jurisprudence, on the other hand, was set up to benefit the state. Their sources of information were, in this order, Quran and trustworthy hadiths, then the amal, or customs and practices of the people of Medina, consensus and opinions of the Sahaba, and contemporary companions of Muhammad that detailed his life to narrators. Then analogy, then what was best for the Ummah, which is a collective term referring to the set of all Muslims, then the tradition of the Ummah. Analogy is way down on the list, coming after the customs of the people of Medina, which is kind of weird. Malik bin Anas, the founder of the Maliki school of jurisprudence, believed that the people who interacted regularly with Muhammad, the bestest person, were by extension the best people, and so were their kids and grandkids. Because of his rather narrow definition of what constituted the best people, the hadiths he accepted were the smallest collection, but he gave them more weight than literally anything else and didn't think much of analogies. This version of Islam is prevalent in North Africa and the UAE. If I were to compare it to a sect of Christianity, I'd say that it's most like the Lutherans. They believe in a strict adherence to scripture first, and that you don't need any kind of human ideas to supplement it. Shafi Islam was founded by a student of Malik bin Anas named al-Shafi. He didn't think much of the whole people from Medina are the best people argument. He thought that all the Sahaba, or early followers of Muhammad, the first generation of followers of Muhammad, were equally important no matter where they were from, but everyone who wasn't the Sahaba were still pretty garbage. He was also very much against the idea of people coming up with rulings based on their own ideas of what Islam is or should be. So his madhab is best compared to a subsect of the Lutherans. Last but certainly won't let you forget them, you've got the Hanbali, which is the work of Ahmed bin Hanbal. This is the sect which gave birth to the Salafist and Wahhabist movements, which you can see the logical and theological conclusion of in ISIS in Saudi Arabia. Hanbali are the ones doing almost all of the terrorism. This is because they don't believe in looking at analogies. Anything that humans have to say, anything that benefits humans, or anything done by humans. They believe in taking literally what the Quran and Hadith say and acting on their literal interpretation. Whether that's killing infidels or stoning women suspected of adultery, they're all about the idea that this is the one true Islam and all others must submit. The propagation of this form of Islam is being done almost entirely by the Saudis. They're the ones who are shipping their books about it everywhere and funding schools and mosques to teach it in foreign countries. The reason why they're doing this is as much financial as it is theological. Once the oil runs dry, the only industry they'll have left is religious tourism. So they want to make sure that as many people as possible believe that it is their duty to go there. That's why most of their construction projects center around Mecca, where they're building up huge hotels for pilgrims. ISIS doesn't think much of this and thinks that their devotion to building up Mecca is un-Islamic because it's a form of idolatry. Surprise, surprise. And now the Saudis are being bitten by the snakes that they released into the world. If I were to compare them to a Christian sect, it would be the Puritans. Then outside of all of that, we have the Sufis. The Sufis are the Pentecostals of Islam. They're the ones with the crazy dancing and music who are mostly interested in experiencing spirituality through inducing a rush of endorphins via rhythmic music and sounds. You also have the Ahmadiyya, which are most similar to the Mormons, in that they have their own ideas of what constitutes a prophet and who prophets are or should be. And they include people as prophets who mainstream Christianity doesn't. Another comment said, in the future video from this young woman, I would like to know more about Islam and Muslims' views on slavery and its continued accepted practice today in Islamic countries. The short answer is, Islam built much of the Islamic empire on the backs of slaves. Muhammad had many slaves himself, and a lot of wars done by Muslims after the initial huge expansion were primarily to capture slaves, especially their incursions into sub-Saharan Africa and India. Interestingly, most of the modern slaves in Muslim lands are from those same raided areas: India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and sub-Saharan Africa. While the slaves sold by ISIS are the most easy to find in the news, most of the slaves in the Muslim world are held in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Those slaves aren't sold in open markets, which is what makes them slightly harder to see. Basically, what happens is that people are brought to the Arab world from other countries as migrant laborers. Then once they get there, their passport and other documentation are taken away by their quote-unquote employers, and they're not permitted to leave the work site without the permission of their employer. Male slaves are not permitted to talk to women, and female slaves are often sexually abused. It's awful, and it's very important that people draw attention to this. So hopefully this provides answers to the questions people had after my last video. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them either in the comment if you're watching this pretty soon after the video was posted, or on my Minds and Facebook page. I'm Sofia Mohamedova on both. Thanks again to Suit for kindly hosting my video. I really appreciate it.